And my language may be that of an adult, but somehow the perceptions are those of a young person. And I think that comes through, and that makes it work as a book for young people.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hobb,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Lois Lowry.
We're closing in on 300 episodes rapidly. Right after the first of the year, we'll be in that 300 show range. And I would really like to thank each of you for tuning in all the time. Those of you that have subscribed over at hankgarner.com, thank you. I appreciate that. It helps other people find the show when you subscribe. There's handy links over the right-hand sidebar at hankgarner.com. I'd like to thank some sponsors today for making all of these shows possible. A huge amount of time, effort, and expense go into producing the show, and it's our faithful sponsors who make all this possible and allow us to bring you 5 shows a week. I don't know many other podcasts that bring you 5 episodes a week, but we're happy to do it, and thank you to our sponsors who allow us to do that. If you would like to sponsor the show, go to hankgarner.com, and there's a handy link up in the menu bar there. Nick Breaker's book Essence, Book 1 Septima, is available now. This is a really unique book that Nick has written. It's kind of the best of science fiction and urban fantasy, mixed with a little bit of romance. It's a really cool mashup of genres that Nick has come up with. I love this book. I think you will too. Book 1 is out now of the Essence series. It's called Septima. And Nick said just the other day that book 2 and 3 are coming very quickly. This is some really, really innovative writing. I think you're going to love it. Go ahead and grab book 1, Septima, now, and be ready for books 2 and 3, which are coming out in rapid succession in 2018. Nick Breaker, Essence, book 1, Septima. Also, The Chronicles of Mirestone is a new collection. If you are like me and love anthologies where you get to sample the work of a lot of different authors, you're going to love this one. If you're also a fan of fantasy, like I am, you're going to love this one. 200 years ago, the dwarven clans of the elvish houses of Mirestone were at peace. The king of the dwarves, in a selfish and greedy move, used his wizards to expand their mountain empire, raising new peaks from the forest floors of their elven neighbors. War and hatred ensue. 6 talented authors lend their voices to a tale of destruction, mistrust, and hope. It's The Chronicles of Mirestone. It's a brand new release. Go pick it up. We're going to hear from some more sponsors later on in the show, and as always, don't forget to stay tuned at the end of the show for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Lois Lowry on the show with me today. Lois is the author of some books that you probably have heard of, Number of the Stars and The Giver, for sure, among many others. Welcome to the show, Miss Lowry.
Well, thank you. Nice to be with you.
Well, thank you. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Boy, it goes way back. I may be the oldest writer you've had on your show because I'm now 80. And my first memory of wanting to be a writer is probably about age 4 or 5. So that's a whole lot of years. However, I do happen to have a very strong set of memories of my early years, so it's not hard for me to go back there. I was a child who loved books and who learned to read early because I had an older sister. So back then, when I was just barely more than a toddler and loving books and realizing that books were written by people, I wanted to be one of those people, and I'm so thrilled now, 75 years later, that I am one.
That's wonderful. You are not the oldest guest we've had on the show. I think that distinction goes to Jerry Pornell, who was on just a few months before he sadly passed away this past year. But that's awesome that your memories go back that far to wanting to be a storyteller. Were you a big reader as a kid?
I was fortunate that my mother had been a teacher before she married, and so ours was a house filled with books. I should make that plural, houses, because I was born into a military family, and we moved frequently, and we always packed up the books and took them to the next place until I was 11, and we moved in 1948 to Tokyo, and we could not take our books, and so very sadly, I donated my collection of books, which was large by then, to the local public library. But when I got to Tokyo, very quickly, I discovered the American Library, not far from where I was to live, and there were almost all books I had left behind. The libraries have also been a large part of my memories in my life.
I'll bet. What sorts of stories captured your imagination back then?
Say that again, which stories?
What types of stories were capturing your imagination?
I was an indiscriminate lover of books, and although we did have all the classics in our home, and so not at age 5, but by 10, I was reading and loving things like Little Women and The Secret Garden. But I also, as a young child, loved, and I sort of cringe now to say this, the Bobbsey Twins. And if you were to go back now and reread those books, you would find them frighteningly or distressingly racist and sexist, I suppose. So those are a thing of the past. But others that I loved were Lois Lowry, and this is amusing because sometimes still I get letters or emails from readers who say, I loved your book, Strawberry Girl, and I have to reply that I'm glad they loved that wonderful book, but it was written by Lois Lowry, who is long dead and not by me. I think one of the reasons I was attracted to her books was because we had the same first name. And my favorite of her books was called Indian Captive. And again, that's a book that's been criticized in contemporary times because it sort of stereotypes Native Americans. But I didn't know that then. And I loved the child in the book, which was illustrated by the author because she looked like me. I think when a reader identifies with the main character, it makes the love for the book even greater.
Absolutely. It's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up about the Bobbsey Twins because it's really interesting to think. We sort of romanticize some of our early experiences and things that we read, and then you go back and you're like, wow, I would never think that now, or it's so it's so,
and it's also so heartening to go back to one and find that it's just as good and just as meaningful as it was when you were a child. Right.
Absolutely. At what point did you know that you wanted to be a writer? That this was more than just a hobby or something that interested you, but that you actually wanted to pursue the craft of writing?
Well, that would have been certainly by age 9 or 10. And in fact, when I was 10 years old and still living in the United States, because as I said, we moved to Japan when I was 11, I wrote a letter to a children's magazine that I subscribed to, a magazine called Jack and Jill. And every month, it was a monthly magazine, there were 2 days in the center that had letters from children, letters from readers. And so I wrote to that magazine again and again. But when I was 10, in 1947, in the summer, I was at summer camp, and my mother wrote to me, no email then, no cell phones, and said that she had heard from Jack and Jill magazine, and they were publishing my letter in their August issue. So I was thrilled, of course. Now, I remember that, but I no longer had a copy of the letter or of the magazine, but I told that story once to an audience, and one of the people in the audience did the research and sent me a copy of the page that had my letter on it. And the only reason I tell this long story is because in the letter it said, I am writing a book called A Dog Named Lucky. I am on chapter 13, and I want to be a writer when I grow up. So that's perhaps the earliest documentation of that wish of mine to be a writer. I have no remnants left of those 13 chapters, and that book was never completed. But I do remember again and again writing stories in my own notebooks. And in fact, I gave a notebook filled with poems by me to an elderly man who was a friend of my grandfather, and who was very fond of me when I was a child because I was a literary child and he was a literary man. And so I presented him with this little notebook filled with poems, and I'm embarrassed to say that I had decorated it with stickers of teddy bears. I was very young, probably 8. And when he died, many years after that, when I was in college, his attorneys sent me that little notebook of my poems, which they had found in his desk. So that's just a kind of sweet memory of mine, of having this elderly friend who every year on my birthday gave me a volume of poetry. Tennyson, I remember, was one. Made me promise to read them. Of course, when I was that age, I didn't, even though I promised. I never did until I got to college and discovered real literature.
Oh, that's funny. When you went to college, did you go to study writing? What did you major in?
I went to Brown University in 1954 when I was 17 years old to major in writing, which at that time, the curriculum at Brown has changed, but at that time they had a major called English Expression, and that was what I was doing, studying writing there. But it was the 1950s, and in 1956, at the end of my sophomore year, when I had just turned 19, I dropped out to get married. I had a boyfriend who was 2 years older, who had graduated from college and been commissioned in the Navy, and was headed off to San Diego. And so we married, and I went with him and left my academic career behind. Although many years later, when my youngest child, youngest of 4, began kindergarten, I went back to college. I was, by then, living in Maine. I went to the University of Southern Maine and completed the 2 years that I owed for a bachelor's degree. It took me 4 years to do them with 4 kids at home, and went on to graduate school there.
So you grew up in a military family, moving around, and then married into one again. How do you feel like the traveling the world and living in different places has affected your ideas on writing and storycraft? Well,
I was always, and still am, an introvert. I was a very, even painfully shy child, and I much preferred to be alone with my books than out shrieking with the other children playing tag in the neighborhood. I remember my mother saying, why don't you go outside and play? But because I was so introverted and shy, when we moved, and I loved moving, I loved the excitement of being in a new place and the curiosity of it. But when we moved, I was not quick to leap into friendships. I was always an observer. And of course, Henry James once said, a writer is someone on whom nothing is lost. And that was me, even when I was 11 and 12. I was hanging back from the exuberance of many children to observe where I was in a new place. And I mentioned age 11 because that's when we moved to a different country with a culture so unlike what I was used to. And I was fascinated by it and watched it and learned from that and observed people. And that's something a writer has to do. I don't know that it's necessary for a writer to be an introvert, but I suspect most of them are. Some of them disguise it well, and there have been famous writers who were also famous personalities like, say, Norman Mailer or Truman Capote, but I was the one who hung back, who didn't talk much, who read and who observed.
Do you feel like being exposed to different cultures maybe opened your eyes to looking at the world a little differently, or maybe ideas about character?
Well, when we moved to Japan, it was not that long after World War II, and so it was a particularly interesting time. I've been to Tokyo several times in recent years, and it's a thriving city of skyscrapers now, but in my day it was a city of bombed out buildings and a humbled people, and all of that was fascinating to me. I was not a scholar of history, but I certainly followed the war news because my father had been in the Pacific while we were home, my mother, 3 children, alone in Pennsylvania. So all of that went into my consciousness and has stayed with me. I grew during my years in Tokyo and summers in the south of Japan to love the Japanese people. It distresses me now. I've recently read a book, nonfiction, set in the Pacific during World War II, and it's very distressing to me to read about how brutal the Japanese were in wartime. But that's what happens. That's what wars are about, I guess. I found the Japanese people to be dignified and reserved and very, very interesting, and also interested in me. I mentioned earlier the book called Indian Captive, in which the child character looked so much like me in the illustrations, and she had in that book, in the illustrations, and it was based on a true story of a young girl who in the late 1700s was captured by Indians in upstate New York and lived the rest of her life with Seneca Indians. And she had in the pictures, at age 12, long, light blonde hair, as did I. In the book, and I have no idea whether this was true in reality, it was probably fictionalized, part of the romantic view of the author, but the child kidnapped there, and then in the living with the tribe, the women in the tribe were fascinated by her blonde hair. And that was something that I found in Tokyo in the 1940s. It was a very safe city. It still is. But at that time, I was able to, as I said, I was a loner of a child, but I had a bicycle, and I rode around the streets of Tokyo on my bike with my long blonde hair. And I remember when I was standing still at a street corner, for example, Japanese women would come up and touch my hair. Not in a frightening way, but very endearingly. They were fascinated by it and by me. That's, of course, would no longer be true. Half the young women in Tokyo have now dyed their own hair platinum blonde or pink.
It's so funny to me to see when that people all over the world are really, we all really want the same things. We're interested in people that are not like us. We want to have our family and our loved ones, and we just want to be happy. And when you strip away all of the things that make us different, it's really it's really heartwarming to realize
it is to get down to the essentials. It's heartwarming, but at the same time, it's troubling to realize that in all these centuries and eons, we have not been able to get beyond the fact that we fall into these conflicts.
Exactly. Yes. And that becomes a recurring theme in a lot of your writing. Was this something that was intentional to you, or were these themes of isolation and loss and and conflict? These things keep coming up over and over. Is that something you intended to do, or is this just what comes out?
Well, I've written, I think, 46 books, and so they're each of them different, and some of them are different genres. But I will point out that for a writer of fiction, conflict is a necessary ingredient in a novel. Even in a lighthearted book, and I've written many of those, there still has to be a problem for the protagonist to grapple with. Otherwise, there's no plot. Or if there's a plot, it's a pretty boring one. So I in these lighthearted books, the conflicts may be fairly superficial ones, but I have written books on darker topics. And in fact, my first book, which was called A Summer to Die, was fiction, but it was a fictional retelling of the early death of my sister. So it's a book about two adolescent girls told from the point of view of the younger daughter about the effect on the whole family of the death of a 16-year-old girl. And, of course, as there was between my sister and me, she was 3 years older, although she was often my best friend, she was also often my worst enemy. She was my sidekick, my first teacher, my partner in crime occasionally. But she died young, and so, as in the book, the younger surviving sister, grappling with grief at the loss of her sister, also grapples with the fact of the conflicts that had been between them. But of course, that's life, and that's humanity, and that's true of all of us, that there are conflicts even with the people we love.
Tell us a little bit about the process for getting that first book published. What was going on in your life when you wrote that book, and how long did it take you to find a publisher and to get it out? Okay,
that would have been the mid-1970s, and I would have been, I'm not that fast at math, but I was born in 1937, 47, 57, 67, 77. So I would have been in my 30s. And as I mentioned, I had gone back to college. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in the early 70s, and then I was in graduate school. And I began while I was in graduate school writing for magazines and also doing photography for magazines. I studied photography in graduate school. My father, who'd been a very fine photographer, had given me, he was getting old and didn't use them anymore, given me his Leicas. So I was doing a lot of that, but fiction had always been my intention. And so now and then I would, when I had time, and I'm chuckling because I can't imagine when I ever found time. I had at that time 4 children who were probably between the ages of 8 and 13, and a husband and a house. But nonetheless, when I had time, using the same typewriter that my father had given me years before, I wrote a short story based on an incident from my own childhood. It was written in the first person, but it was autobiographical. And I sent it off to a magazine which published it. This would have been, say, 1975. And it was a story from my childhood, as I said. And a book publisher, a publisher of children's books, Houghton Mifflin, I mean, they publish all kinds of books, but an editor from the children's department read that story. It was written for adults, but it was seen through the eyes of a child. And she wrote to me. Actually, she wrote to me in care of the magazine, and they forwarded her letter, asking if I would consider writing a book for young people. I had never thought of doing that, even though I had 4 kids and our house was filled with children's books. I had concentrated on writing for adults. But with that invitation from that editor, that's when I sat down and wrote the book based on the relationship of me and my sister and the death of my sister. And they had made no promise to publish it, but because they had requested it, had asked me to write it, I did not have to go through the process of just sending it blindly to a person I didn't know. I had not met this editor, but we had corresponded, so I sent her the manuscript. And Houghton Mifflin did publish that book in 1977. And as it happened, it won the IRA, that's the International Reading Association Award for the best first novel for young people. And so the publisher was very pleased with that, as was I, although I didn't know anything about children's book publishing. I didn't realize what a big deal it was. But what really affected me, I think, was the response from readers. It predated email, but letters began to come in from young readers who had been deeply affected by that book. I had never really before realized the profound effect that a book can have on a young reader, although certainly books had had that effect on me. So because of that, I then sat down and began to write a second book for young people. And as it turned out, Houghton Mifflin, with a couple of exceptions, has published all of my books since those early days in the 70s. One of the exceptions, interestingly, is Scholastic, which came up with or found that old story in Red Book, the one that I had written that began, it was morning, early, barely light, cold for November. I was 9, and the war was over. And it was a story about a child whose father has returned from the war and is a stranger to her. And they asked my permission to publish that to have it illustrated, and it was published as a picture book, probably maybe 5-7 years ago now. The title of it is Crow Call. I've never met the illustrator, but they chose exactly the right person. And he asked for a photograph of me at age 9 or so when the story took place. And so the little girl that he painted and who is in that book is me, and the illustrations are beautiful. So now I've forgotten what question I was answering. How my first book came to be published. But that's how it was. I never had to go through the process of just blindly sending a manuscript out to unknown publishers, because they had come to me and requested that first book.
And to have the long relationship with your publisher, Houghton Mifflin, that you've had all these years is amazing. That is, that's almost unheard of.
It is now. And for many of those years, it was the same editor. He retired some years ago. So for the past, I don't know how many years or how many books, but perhaps the past 8 books have been with a different editor, but still with Houghton Mifflin, although their name has changed too, and it's now Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, because they merged with Harcourt Brace. But it has been a long and productive and happy relationship between author and publisher.
Hey, authors, you need an author platform. We have talked about this over and over again. You need to have a way to communicate with your readers, and Third Scribe is there to help you do that. They are committed to authors and to readers and connecting the two of them together. There's been a lot of talk lately about some changes going on over at Goodreads and the way that they're handling some of their promotions and book giveaways and going to be charging authors a great amount of money for a service that used to be free. Third Scribe offers a great alternative to that. It's a great place to gather readers where you can talk about the books that you love, and it's a great place for authors to showcase their work and to connect with those readers. ThirdScribe.com is built for readers and writers. It's all about books, and that's all it's about. Go check them out today at ThirdScribe.com. Also, thanks to our good friend Daniel Arthur Smith and Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 20 is out now. I have a feeling there's going to be a new episode out any day now. You're going to love this series if you like the old pulp magazines. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned expertly grabs that old feeling that you used to get from reading pulp and comic magazines. Go pick it up today, Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. It's my favorite monthly publication. Also, I'd like to thank The Future Chronicles. These are the very cutting-edge collections of science fiction and fantasy. If you want to know where the writers of tomorrow are coming from, they're coming from the Future Chronicles. There's a link over in the right-hand sidebar where you can go collect these amazing collections of stories of the very best speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. Thank you to the Future Chronicles. Our friend Terry R. Hill has two amazing brand new books out, 2 months with Harvey and Joseph of Bethlehem. As Terry was finishing the book Joseph of Bethlehem, which is an amazing book all about the forgotten hero of the Christmas story, and that's Joseph. This is full of great historical research and also a story that will grab you by the heart. Joseph of Bethlehem is the perfect book for this time of year. But when Terry was finishing that book, he and his family were hit by Hurricane Harvey. And for the next 2 months, his community dealt with the fallout and aftermath of this massive storm. And sadly, there are a lot of people in the Houston area where Terry lives that are still dealing with the fallout of Hurricane Harvey. This amazing book is his on-the-ground reporting of what happened during and after Hurricane Harvey. Some amazing pictures told through the lens of social media as the event was unfolding. And the proceeds of this book are going to folks still dealing with Hurricane Harvey. 2 months with Harvey and Joseph of Bethlehem. Go pick them up both from Terry R. Hill, and you can get a signed copy of each of those at terryrhill.net. Now back to the show. That's amazing. You said earlier that first book to you was a book for adults, but through the eyes of a youngster. Did that distinction come to mean something different to you when you're in the publishing industry and you kind of realize about children's books and all that? But did I understand right that you felt like that book was a book for adults? It just happened to have a young protagonist?
Well, no, you're not exactly right. So I'll correct you a little bit. The story that was published in a magazine was a story for adults, and it was published in an adult magazine. The magazine still exists, I think, Red Book. It no longer publishes fiction. Few magazines do. But that was a story intended and written for adults. However, many years later, when Scholastic took that story and with mine making some minor changes to it, illustrated it, and made it into a picture book, it's now a story for all ages, I think. It's not a picture book for little children. But the editor who came to me and asked me to do a book was an editor in the children's book department at Houghton Mifflin. So I knew that I was writing a book for young readers. And that first book was intended for that. The protagonist, again, a disguised, fictionalized me, was 13 years old in that book. And so all of my books have been written for the so-called children's book department at Houghton Mifflin. And some of them have been for younger children, and many of them have been for older teenagers. But they all have one thing in common, which is that they'll have a young protagonist. I have not consciously simplified my language at all, and nor has the publisher ever asked me to. So I hope that I've never written down to the audience, but certainly it has always been an audience of young people. I have done some writing for adults on the side in recent years, but writing for young people remains my primary focus.
You mentioned that you never write down to children. I think that's there are some nuances to writing for children that a lot of writers just don't understand. When you're writing for that market, if you're not writing down, how do you connect with that audience while maintaining the level of literacy and the level of not dumbing it down? How do you communicate with that age group?
I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that I have a good and a long memory, and that's true. I have very clear memories of being those ages, age 5 or 7 or 8 or 10. And so once I choose a protagonist for a piece of fiction, and know what age that person is, then I simply go back in my memory to myself at that age, and I write through the eyes of myself at 8 or 10 or 12 or 15, because I remember still what it felt like being that age. And my language may be that of an adult, but somehow the perceptions are those of a young person. And I think that comes through, and that makes it work as a book for young people.
It's really about connecting with that 5 or 6 or 7 or 10-year-old version of yourself. I like that. I like that. My son, who is 13 and in the 8th grade, came home a couple of months ago, and he had a copy of Number the Stars. And he said that his English class was reading Number the Stars together, and they had a whole curriculum built around it. And he came home every day from school talking about this book, and it just really captivated him, and really. I've not seen him that engrossed in a story and that emotionally invested in a story in quite some time. Where did that story come from for you, and what was the motivation behind writing it?
Yeah, let me say first that I've been gratified that despite the fact that book has, and we think when it was published, 1989, I think, so it's been around for a long time. And it has a photograph on the cover of a young girl. It's a photograph that I took. As I mentioned, I used to be a photographer. And despite the haunting face of a young girl on the cover, boys do like that book. They wouldn't pick it up in a bookstore or a library because of the girl on the cover, but it very often is used in classrooms, as your son discovered. That particular story came about because I had a close friend. She has died in recent years, but she and I were close to the same age. And I met her in Portland, Maine, where I lived and where she lived. Our husbands were law partners. And time passed. Our children were friends, and we were close friends. And she was Danish. She had been born and brought up in Denmark, but she had met her husband, American, when he was stationed in Europe with the Army. So time passed, years passed, our children grew up and went off on their own, and both of us, sadly, were divorced. And so one time we took a vacation together. We went to Bermuda together for a week, and that gave us a lot of time to sit and talk without the distractions that we'd always had. And we talked a lot about our childhoods. And I think that was the first time that she told me of the death of an older sister when she was young. And perhaps I had told her of the death of my sister. And so I asked her about her loss of her sister, and she explained that her sister had been newly married, expecting a baby, but had died in childbirth along with the baby. And I was shocked by that, because Denmark is a civilized country with great medical care. I know because I've once been in a Danish hospital in the emergency room, luckily for nothing serious. But I was shocked at a young woman dying in childbirth, and she explained that it was during the war when Denmark was occupied by the Nazis, and they had, at that time, very poor medical care and also poor nutrition. And so I had probably read about, studied about, taken tests on that part of World War II that involved Denmark and the occupation by Germany. But I hadn't remembered it, and I had not remembered what she went on to tell me about how the Danish population saved their Jewish population. It really was a remarkable story of the rising up of an entire population of Christians to hide and save and to safety their population of between 6,000 and 7,000 Jewish people. And so I thought, since I probably knew of it and hadn't remembered it, and it was worth remembering, I wanted to find a way to tell it so that children would remember it. And so I created a child, a 10-year-old girl, and put her down in Denmark, in Copenhagen in 1943, to tell that history, but through the eyes of a child who was experiencing it, and who was not knowing all the historic details that an adult would perhaps know, was just experiencing what affected her and her family, and her Jewish friend whom she and her family were able to save. And so that was the background of that book. And it's very gratifying to me to know that it's been published in, I don't know how many different languages, 20, 30. And it's had a remarkable life in Denmark and other countries. But of particular gratification to me is the fact that my only granddaughter is German. My son married a German woman. They lived in Germany. My granddaughter has grown up there. And in the German public school system, which my granddaughter has gone through, they read the German translation of Number the Stars. And I've observed how Germany has undertaken to, and it's difficult for them, with such a painful history, they nonetheless feel they have to educate their children about the Holocaust. And Number the Stars is one of the books that they use, and that my granddaughter, whose last name is Lowry, of course, because she's my son's daughter, and I'm amused because the Germans have a difficult time pronouncing her last name with its W, which they want to say is V. So she says when she was little, every time she moved to a new class, new grade, she cringed when the teacher took the roll and came to the name Lowry and couldn't pronounce it very easily.
Oh, that's the best. When you were writing that book, did you have any idea that the story would have the legs that it has, that it would be endeared to so many people and would have the longevity that this book has had?
No, and I think one doesn't and shouldn't think about such things when you're writing a story. I knew it was an interesting and meaningful and important story, and I worked hard to get the facts correct. And I did a lot of research and went to Denmark, but I never really thought about. I guess I was aware that the audience would be young because I was writing it for young. To think about, what will reviewers say, or will it win awards, or will it sell a lot of copies? Will I make money from it? You just don't think about things like that. If you do, you shouldn't. And if you do, you become like the centipede, thinking about his legs and then can't walk. So no, that never really crosses my mind. I just try in every case to tell the best story that I can in the best way that I can.
When you write something that becomes so iconic almost, is there pressure from the publisher and from readers to follow that up with a story similar to that and to kind of become the Holocaust writer? Not certainly from my publisher, and I've been very fortunate with my publisher. They've never pressured me to do anything. Which has freed me to do lots of different kinds of things. However, young readers, when they read a book and fall in love with a character and don't want the book to end, then they write to me. And in the old days, it was letters, but now, and it's still all these years later, now it's emails from kids. And they want me to write another book about what happened to the two girls in Number the Stars, Anne Marie and Ellen. And I have to explain to them each time that a second book would be boring. What happened was the war ended, and that's true. It says that at the end of Number the Stars. Most of the Danish Jews who had been taken to Sweden returned to their homes in Denmark. Some went to other places, some went to Israel, and some stayed in Sweden because they had come to love Sweden. But they lived peacefully, happily ever after. So there's no conflict, and there's no story to be told. However, I remember one young reader sending me, she said she herself had written not a sequel, but a final chapter to Number the Stars. And her chapter was this. After the war, Anne Marie decided to look for her friend Ellen. So she went to Sweden. She went into a restaurant, and there was Ellen at the salad bar. I love it. I love it. Another book of yours that people are probably very familiar with is called The Giver, and the Giver is actually one of 4 books. This was made into a major motion picture a few years ago. Where did this story come from?
Well, I've often been asked that, and, stories arise out of the imagination, but the imagination is often triggered by something you experience or read about. And the closest I can come to identifying that for The Giver is the fact that, that was published in 1993, I believe. My father at that time was very old, and he was in an assisted living facility in Virginia. I lived in Boston at the time. But my brother lived in Virginia, so my parents were there, and my mother was in a nursing home. Her health was very poor, and she would die that year. But my father was up and about, although he was shuffling about, and his memory was starting to fade. And I would fly down there about once every 6 weeks to visit them. My mother, though she was very frail and on oxygen and also blind, nonetheless, her mind was intact, and she loved to talk about the past. That was really where she lived in her memories. And so I would sit with her, and we would reminisce, and she sometimes talked about my sister and the death of my sister. But then when she tired, I would go to visit Dad in the other section of the same place. And my brother and I had prepared a photograph album for Dad, filled with photographs from the past, places we had lived, and one photograph of a car he had loved. My dad was a car guy. And so he would look at that photograph, and he would always say, Chrysler 300, best car I ever had. But I used that photograph album just to trigger conversation with him. And this particular visit in 1993, or perhaps the year before that, the book was published in 93, I turned the page, and there was a picture of 2 little blonde girls in Honolulu. And he smiled, and he said, there you are with your sister. And then he looked a little abashed, and he said, I can't remember her name. And I said, her name was Helen, Dad. She was named for her grandmother. And he said, whatever happened to her? And I had to say, she died, Dad, because he had forgotten it. And it was as if, because he had forgotten, as if it had just happened. He was devastated. And I turned the page, and there were other pictures, houses, cars, whatever. But within the next 5 minutes or so, there was a picture of 2 blonde teenage girls laughing, and he smiled. He said, oh, there you are with Helen. And then he said, I can't remember what happened to her. And I had to tell him again, she died, Dad. And when I was driving back to the airport after that visit, I began to think about that. And of course, when a writer begins to wonder about something and to think, what if, then a story begins to take place, to take shape. And what I thought was, what if there were a way that we could, I don't know, perhaps with a pill or a shot or some kind of medication, obliterate all the sad memories that we have, all the frightening memories that we have? What if we only remembered the good stuff? And of course, the more I thought about that, the more I realized it was a complex question, and one that I might present and try to answer through a story. And so that became my next book. And I have never been a writer of science fiction or fantasy, but I realized right away that, of course, it would have to be a book set in the future. And so it is, but I don't think of it as science fiction, although it's sometimes designated as that. I suppose it's fantasy, because fantasy is defined as things that can't happen. Science fiction is defined as things that could happen, I suppose. I just think of it as a story, I just created a community which was probably based on all the army posts I had lived on, a community where everybody lives in the same sort of house by a rigid set of rules. I had lived that way all my life. It felt familiar. And then I just took it a little farther in every direction, and that's the book that turned out to be The Giver.
I've said many times that whether it be fantasy or science fiction or whatever the genre window dressing, the thing that really captivates us are the human stories, and the stories of what makes us human, what makes us interact with each other the way we do, what makes our experiences. How do they make us who we are? And then the genre stuff is just window dressing. That just makes the story interesting, or gives it an interesting setting or whatever. But yeah, I'm like you. I never thought of it as science fiction until you started saying that. And I said, well, yeah, I guess it is. But that it's a really complex problem to start thinking about. And the problem of grief and loss and pain and suffering, and what if we do eliminate it all? Are we as human as we could be? Do we get the same human experience?
Yeah.
What was some of the feedback that you got about that book? Because it is a little darker than maybe some of the happy children's books that you write. It's pretty deep, dark subject matter. How did people respond to it?
Well, the response has been monumental, and again, it's been 25 years. Next year, 25th anniversary edition will come out of that book. And I still, every day, every week, I get 50, 100 emails, and most of them are still about The Giver. Of course, that's in part because it's been a movie, it's been an opera, it's been a play. I just have been I live in Maine, but I've just been down in Florida to see yet one more time a play of The Giver. And the response from the beginning was different from the response I'd had up till that time. And it was, at first, the difference was apparent in that I heard from as many adults as I heard from kids, and that had not been true before. And I don't know really, for the most part, how adults came upon the book. In some cases, a kid would bring it home from school and say, "Hey, Mom, read this." But I've had letters from people who have told me that their psychiatrist suggested that they read it. I have had letters from groups of men who are in group therapy because of PTSD, who find the book important because it talks about sharing and the alleviation of pain by the sharing of pain. So it goes in all directions. It also, in a very short period of time after its publication, became one of the most challenged books in the United States. Challenged is not the same as banned. Challenged means, of course, that somebody has objected to the book, want it removed from a library or a school, and that goes through a legal proceeding. In most cases, it was returned to the bookshelves. In some cases, it was actually banned, although I doubt if that's still true. I mean, certainly in the years since, there have been books that have been much darker. And if you just think of The Hunger Games, which is a book about children killing other children. The Giver seems very mild now compared to that. But it did provoke early on a lot of controversy. There was a website that called me the Antichrist. At the same time, many church curricula took it up, found religious significance in it. And I'm talking about churches of all denominations, from Baptist to Mormon to Catholic. And within the Jewish faith, people began giving it as a bar mitzvah gift, seeing it not as a Christian metaphor, but as a book about a boy taking on the responsibilities of manhood. So it really has had a remarkable journey. And again, to other countries, it was the first book for young people in English translated into, now I'm forgetting whether it was Thai or Vietnamese. They always send me a copy of this translated book, and in some cases I can't even identify the language because the alphabet is so different. But anyway, it's still out there, and I had no intention of writing a sequel to it, although immediately the requests started coming. But some years later, I began to write another book, and I began the way I always do, with a character who comes to my imagination, usually in a setting that has something mysterious about it or something that you want to know more about. And so I began to write about a young girl who was sitting beside the body of her mother in a very primitive, horrible place. And I thought at first as primitive. It may go back centuries. I thought I might have to start researching woolly mammoths. But then as I wrote more and more, creating this other community, very primitive community, but realizing that they were not in the past but in the future, a community that because of some horrible global catastrophe had lost their technology, I began to see that it connected to the giver. And so it appeared as not a sequel but a companion volume, and then followed by a third. And then more recently, the fourth book attempts to collect all the characters from the previous three. And in fact, the baby in the first book is now an adolescent and is one of the main characters in the fourth book. So it attempted to show the reader, who had been wringing their hands about it all these years, where everybody was and what happened to each of those characters. And I think it does that. It ties it up at the end. However, I'm amused by the fact that because the fourth book is long, it's 400 pages, it encompasses 14 years, because it begins with the birth of that baby and concludes with him an adolescent. And so it's a long book, and along the way in it, other new characters are introduced. And so now I'm getting the letters saying, but what happened to, and people have taken up the cause of certain new characters that they fell in love with along the way in the fourth book. So maybe there's no end to that. There's an end to my writing them. I'm not going to write a fifth one, but it's kind of nice that there's no end to the readers who care about those characters and want to know more about them.
You mentioned earlier that that story ideas come from everywhere, and you know, sometimes there's sort of an inciting incident or a memory or something that triggers the story idea. When you get finished with a book, do you ever look back and just think, wow, where did that come from? That was you know, I never could have imagined that, and then here it is.
Yeah. Well, it won't surprise you to know that I have a very vivid imagination, and so there are things in there all the time, and some of them work their way to the surface and become a story. And a surprising thing happened along the way in one of those giver books, in the second book. There is a reference. I mean, this is the primitive society who has lost their technology and their civilization, but there is reference to their past, and there's a description of the toppling of the two tall buildings. And people, of course, read that as a description of 9/11. And the interesting thing is that it was written several years before that happened. So maybe there's what do I want to say, a universality to the cyclic nature of these things, of these disasters and recoveries from disasters, and you know, things that loom still, I suppose, on the horizon. And there's a way that they find their way into the imagination and then come out, at least from me, in story form. Also, in the third book, which is called Messenger, and I don't recall what year it was published, but it's years ago. One of the conflicts within the book is that in this seemingly very pleasant and congenial community where Jonas and Gabriel now live, because the book is set there, there is now murmurs and discontent because I don't think the word immigrants is used, but people from other places are coming there. And they've always welcomed them, but now people are unhappy. They're saying there are too many of them, they don't speak our language, and they eat our food, and let's build a wall, they say. And they hold a meeting, a public meeting in this community, to vote, and they vote, in fact, to build a wall. And all of this book was written some years ago, and suddenly, I don't know how to pronounce the word that is spelled Prescient, prescient. It was foreseeing something that, in fact, would happen in truth in the future. I find that fascinating, and I don't have any explanation for it. But it's unconscious at play, I suppose.
Yeah, and sometimes we just have to chalk it up to the magic of story to get down to the heart of the matter.
I think Joseph Campbell, in his writing about myth, talks about that there are certain things that recur in myth or story, and one, incidentally, I mean, I haven't read Campbell in a very long time, but I know he talks about the journey of the hero, and if you picture Jonas, for example, in The Giver, there's always a journey, and often there is a wise elder who helps the hero on his journey. And I wasn't aware of that being such a classic description when I was writing the book, but it does. And in my very first book, when the girl is dealing with the impending death and then the death of her sister, she turns to an old man who lives down the road and who gives her comfort and wisdom. So I think Campbell was right. It takes all forms, but there it is, and it appears again and again.
That's right. Miss Lowry, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today. If people want to know more about your writing and kind of dig through your back catalog, where can people connect with you?
They can go to my website, which is www.loislowry, as one word, .com. And when they're there, they can click on the place where it says, I think it says, email me. And there is a picture drawn by me, a cartoon of me sitting at a laptop, and they just poke at that, and an email will come up, and they can send it to me. I get those emails every day.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
He was just 7 when his parents died. Eliza received the news of their death on Halloween morning, but she kept it from Jason for 2 more days. She sent him out trick-or-treating. He was a vampire. He spun around in the living room, eyes wild, shouting, "I am the living dead!" and wondering why they didn't laugh. On November 2nd, after school, Eliza told him. His parents were dead. It was a bleak time. He wanted silence. He wanted darkness. He cried great rolling tears. In early spring, he ran away from home, which means he stole $5, put a box of Cheez-Its in a pillowcase, and walked 7 blocks. He slept in a field, glad to be miserable. He wanted to freeze to death, to be with his mom and dad, to not feel anything. His grandmother found him at a playground near the river, fallen in the dust with his shoulder against the slope of a teeter-totter, the other end riderless, suspended. He saw her trudging up the hill. She looked twice her usual size in her winter coat, and frightening. "Let's go home, Jason." He knew he was in trouble. He knew what home meant. It meant a paddling or worse. Eliza opened her big winter coat and, straining, slipped down into the dust next to him. She drew him into her warm body, wrapping him in the coat. She flipped the collar up, rubbed her hands together, and cupped them over his ears. "Brr, you're an ice cube, but it feels good, kinda. It's good to get really cold sometimes. Wakes you up." They were cheek to cheek against the teeter-totter, bundled together as the sky turned from gray to orange. The ground stung, but they sat a long time. "Why?" The word was just a tiny puff of vapor that slipped from his lips and into the wind, but it was also big and heavy. She knew what his little boy heart had asked. She understood the universe of longing and confusion and hurt in that one whispered word. We all die, baby. In all the long, long history of the world, there's not been one of us who didn't. I'll die, he said. It wasn't a question, but it was. Yes, and I'll die. A lot sooner. And the why is just... it's just there. It just is. We're not around to see what was before us, and we're not here to see what happens after. The trees on the edge of the playground shivered with dawn. But we're here now, she said, and pulled him tighter until his cheekbone felt sore from pressing against hers. And it has to be enough. It has to be. Look at all we have now. Really look. He really looked. It was just a small playground off the main road of an unimportant New England town. But in the distance he could see the wide Kennebec River, and the sky was pink above it. He saw small ships moored, trimmed in red and baby blue, rocking against the current. He saw a robin on the railing of a dock, toes pointed inward, making occasional hops that were also flight. The town was waking up. There was a light in the bakery and one in the grocery. There was an empty can of beer on a picnic table and wildflowers by the road. There was wind and trees swaying gently. There was his own breath in his own lungs. There was his grandmother, her body, her heartbeat against his back as he leaned against her chest. There was his own life and hers, and a world to live them in. And it was enough.